Richard Caldwell thought he had committed the perfect crime. He had the high-priced lawyers, the hidden offshore accounts, and a judge who seemed wrapped around his finger. He looked his weeping wife in the eye and whispered, "You'll get nothing. It's already over." And for a moment, he was right. He walked out of that courtroom laughing, already celebrating his victory, with his mistress on his arm. But Richard made one fatal mistake. He forgot about her past. He forgot who her father was. And when those courtroom doors swung open on the final day of sentencing, Richard's smile didn't just fade, it died. This is the story of the most brutal divorce case in Seattle history, and the twist that no one saw coming. The divorce of Richard and Jennifer Caldwell wasn't just a separation, it was a demolition. To the outside world, specifically the high society circles of Bellevue and Medina to Washington, they were the golden standard. Richard was the CEO of Nexus Stream, a cloud computing firm that had gone public 3 years prior, turning him into a crying wealthy tech mogul overnight. He was charismatic, sharp-jawed, and wore tailored Italian suits that cost more than most people's cars. Jennifer was the woman beside him, or rather, the woman standing quietly in his shadow. She was a striking beauty, with a kind face and a patience that friends often described as saint-like. She had been there when Richard was coding in a moldy basement apartment in Tacoma, eating instant ramen and borrowing money for server space. She had worked double shifts as a nurse to pay their rent, sacrificing her own dreams of medical school to fuel his ambition. But money changes people. For Richard, it acted like a magnifying glass for his narcissism. The end didn't come with a bang, but with a cold, calculated silence. It was October 14th, their 12th wedding anniversary. Jennifer had prepared a private dinner at their lakefront estate. She had bought him a vintage 1965 Rolex, a reminder of the year his father was born. Richard came home at 11 p.m. He didn't look at the food. He didn't look at her. He walked into the living room, poured himself a scotch, and placed a thick manila envelope on the marble coffee table. "What's this?" Jennifer asked, her stomach tightening. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly. "Read it," Richard said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. His voice was devoid of emotion, as if he were firing a junior developer. Jennifer opened the envelope. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." She looked up, the breath knocked out of her. "Richard, is this a joke?" "I'm moving out tonight," Richard said, checking his phone. "I'm staying at the Four Seasons until the penthouse is ready. I've already canceled your credit cards to prevent retaliatory spending, and the joint accounts are frozen pending the preliminary hearing. You have access to the checking account with $5,000 in it. Make it last." "5,000?" Jennifer gasped. "Richard, the mortgage alone is... The house goes on the market next week. You need to be out by the 1st. He finally looked at her, his eyes cold and dead. "And don't bother hiring a big lawyer, Jen. I've already retainer-conflicted the top 5 firms in the city. You can't afford them anyway." He set his glass down on a coaster, careful not to ruin the finish, and walked to the door. "Why?" she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "After everything I did for you?" Richard paused, hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. "Because I've outgrown you, Jen. You're a nurse from Tacoma. I'm a CEO. It's just business." He walked out. Outside, the engine of a Porsche idled. As Jennifer looked through the window, she saw a woman in the passenger seat. A blonde woman, much younger, scrolling through her phone. It was Brittany, his 24-year-old executive assistant. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was financial warfare. And Richard had practically already declared victory. In the weeks that followed, Jennifer learned the true extent of Richard's cruelty. He wasn't just leaving her, he was erasing her. Richard had hired Robert Sterling. In the legal world, Sterling wasn't a lawyer. He was a hitman in a 3-piece suit. He was known for his scorched earth tactics. If you were up against Sterling, you didn't just lose the case. You lost your dignity, your reputation, and usually your sanity. Sterling's strategy was brutal efficiency. He filed motion after motion, burying Jennifer in paperwork she couldn't understand. He claimed that the millions Richard made were separate property because the company was incorporated before the marriage technically began a lie, but one buried under complex corporate restructuring documents that would take a forensic accountant months to unravel. Jennifer was drowning. As Richard had promised, the top firms in Seattle wouldn't touch her. He had paid them all consultation fees just to create a conflict of interest. Desperate, Jennifer found herself in a strip mall in Renton, South Seattle, standing in front of a glass door that read, Henry Oldman, Attorney at Law, Wills, Estates, and Family Law. The office smelled like stale coffee and old paper. Henry Oldman was a man in his late 60s with unruly gray hair, a stain on his tie, and a desk that looked like a bomb had gone off in a library. He wasn't a shark. He looked more like a tired basset hound. Mrs. Caldwell, Henry said, gesturing to a chair with a broken spring. I've heard of your husband. I'll be honest with you. I mostly handled DUIs and contested wills for grandmothers. Going up against Robert Sterling? That's like bringing a spoon to a gunfight. I have no one else, Jennifer said, her voice cracking. He cut off my funds. I'm staying in a motel. He's trying to say I was abusive. He's trying to say I contributed nothing to Nexus Stream. Henry, I wrote the business plan. I paid for the servers on my nurse's salary. Henry took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at the woman sitting across from him, broken, exhausted, but with a fire of truth in her eyes. He hated bullies, and Richard Caldwell sounded like the biggest bully in the state. I can't promise you we'll win, Henry sighed, pulling a yellow legal pad toward him. Sterling is going to try to bury us, but I'll take the case. My fee is, well, we'll worry about the fee later. The preliminary hearings were a bloodbath. Inside the courtroom, Robert Sterling was theatrical. He painted Jennifer as a gold digger who had been emotionally unstable and a burden on Richard's brilliant rise to success. Your Honor, Sterling boomed, pacing the floor, Mr. Caldwell is a visionary. Nexus Stream is his intellectual property. Miss Caldwell is simply a former nurse who enjoyed the lifestyle my client provided. Now that the marriage has dissolved, she seeks to plunder the company's assets she had no hand in creating. Jennifer sat silently, gripping Henry's hand under the table. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them about the nights Richard cried in her arms because the code wasn't working, or how she edited every single pitch deck he sent to investors. But the judge, the Honorable Judge Pendergast, seemed enamored with Richard. Pendergast was a man who respected status, and Richard Caldwell was the status king of Seattle. Motion for temporary spousal support denied, Judge Pendergast ruled, banging the gavel. Miss Caldwell is a licensed nurse. She is capable of working. Mr. Caldwell will provide a one-time payment of $10,000 for relocation expenses. We will reconvene for the trial on the division of assets in 3 months. Richard turned to Jennifer. He didn't smile. He just winked. A slow, deliberate wink that said, I own this room. 3 months. That was all the time they had to prove Richard was hiding money. Jennifer moved into a small studio apartment. She went back to working night shifts at the hospital, exhausted, her eyes permanently rimmed with red. Every spare moment was spent in Henry Oldman's cluttered office, going over boxes of bank statements. It doesn't make sense, Jennifer said, one rainy Tuesday night, slamming a document down. Richard bought a villa in Tuscany last year. I saw the photos on his phone, but there's no record of the purchase in the joint accounts or his personal accounts. Henry squinted at the spreadsheet. If he bought it, he didn't use his own name. He used a shell company. But which one? Jennifer asked. He has dozens of LLCs under Nexus Stream. Henry sighed. We need a forensic accountant, Jen. A good one costs $300 an hour. We have. He checked his wallet. About $40 and a coupon for pizza. They were hitting a wall. Richard and Sterling were burying the truth under layers of corporate obfuscation. They sent over thousands of pages of discovery, mostly useless junk data, meant to waste Henry's time. It was a classic Sterling tactic. Hide the needle in a haystack, then bury the haystack in a landfill. One night, a week before the trial, Jennifer was digging through an old box of files she had managed to salvage from the house before she was kicked out. It was mostly tax returns from their early years. She found a crumpled receipt from 7 years ago. It was for a consultation with a law firm in the Cayman Islands. The amount was $5,000. Henry, she called him, at 2 a.m. Who is Triton Holdings? Never heard of them, Henry groaned, half asleep. I found a receipt. Richard paid an incorporation fee for Triton Holdings in the Caymans 7 years ago. That was right before Nexus got its first big funding round. Henry woke up instantly. If Triton Holdings is the parent company for his offshore assets, and he didn't disclose it in the discovery phase, that's perjury. That's fraud. Can we prove he owns it? We need the shareholder registry from the Caymans. That takes a court order, and Pendergast won't give it to us without probable cause. And right now, a 7-year-old receipt isn't enough. Jennifer felt the hope drain out of her. They were so close, yet so far. The day before the trial, Richard requested a settlement meeting. They met in the glass-walled conference room of Sterling's high-rise office. Richard looked tan, rested, and expensive. Brittany was sitting next to him, wearing a diamond ring that Jennifer recognized it was a resetting of her own grandmother's diamond, which Richard had claimed was lost during the move. Jennifer felt bile rise in her throat. Here's the offer, Sterling said, sliding a single piece of paper across the mahogany table. $200,000. A clean break. You sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. You never speak of Richard or Nexus Stream again, and you walk away. $200,000? Henry scoffed. The company is valued at $400 million. This is an insult. Richard leaned forward, his voice silky and menacing. It's charity, Henry. Take it, or I go into that courtroom tomorrow and I destroy her. I'll bring up the depression medication she took 3 years ago. I'll paint her as mentally incompetent. I'll make sure she loses her nursing license. I will burn her entire life to the ground. Jennifer looked at the man she had loved for 12 years. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a monster made of money. She stood up, her hands shaking, but her voice steady. No. Richard laughed. A harsh, barking sound. Suit yourself. See you in court, honey. Bring a helmet. As they walked out, Henry looked worried. Jen, if we go to trial with what we have, we're going to lose. He has the judge. He has the money. We have a receipt for a shell company we can't prove exists. I know, Jennifer said, staring out at the rain-slicked streets of Seattle, but I'm not signing that paper. I'd rather lose fighting than let him buy my silence. She didn't know it yet, but help was coming. It just wasn't coming from a lawyer. Back in her tiny apartment, Jennifer's phone rang. It was a blocked number. Hello? Jennifer? The voice was raspy, deep, and sounded like it hadn't been used in a long time. Jennifer froze. She hadn't heard that voice in 15 years, not since the day her father walked out on her and her mother to protect them, as he had claimed in a cryptic note. Dad? She whispered. I heard about Richard, the voice said. I heard he's trying to bury you. Where are you? Mom said you were dead. I'm not dead. I've been away. Listen to me carefully, Jennifer. Don't take the settlement. Go to court tomorrow. Why? Dad, we have nothing. We're going to lose. You won't lose, her father said. Just make sure the doors are unlocked. I'm coming home. The line went dead. The morning of the final hearing, Seattle was drowning in a torrential downpour. It felt fitting. The courtroom of the Honorable William Pendergast was packed. Word had gotten out that Richard Caldwell, the tech darling of the Pacific Northwest, was finalizing his divorce. Reporters lined the back benches, their pens poised to record Richard's triumph. Jennifer sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a simple gray suit she had bought at a thrift store. She looked small against the towering mahogany backdrop of the court. Beside her, Henry Oldman was shuffling papers, his hands shaking slightly. He looked like a man preparing for a firing squad. On the other side, Richard looked magnificent. He was joking with Robert Sterling, checking his watch, and occasionally glancing at the reporters with a practiced, somber nod. He was playing the part of the regretful but firm leader perfectly. All rise, the bailiff bellowed. Judge Pendergast swept in, his robes billowing. He didn't look at Jennifer. He looked straight at Richard and gave a tight, acknowledging nod. We are here to finalize the dissolution of marriage and the division of assets in the matter of Caldwell v. Caldwell, Pendergast droned. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed. For the next 3 hours, Robert Sterling put on a masterclass in cruelty. He called Jennifer to the stand and proceeded to dissect her life with a scalpel. Mrs. Caldwell, Sterling said, pacing like a predator, you claim you supported my client during the founding of Nexus Stream. Yet, do you have a degree in computer science? No, Jennifer said quietly. I'm a nurse. I see. Did you write a single line of code for the proprietary algorithm that is now worth $400 million? No, but I worked double shifts to pay for the electricity that ran the servers. I cooked every meal. I managed the household so Richard could focus. Objection, Sterling barked. Irrelevant. Paying an electric bill does not entitle one to equity in a billion-dollar IP. By your logic, Mrs. Caldwell, the local utility company, should also own a share of Nexus Stream. Snickers rippled through the courtroom. Richard smirked, covering his mouth with his hand to hide it. Henry Oldman tried to fight back. He stood up, his tie crooked. Your Honor, this is a community property state. The contributions of a spouse to the marriage allow the other spouse to succeed. That is the letter of the law. The law, Judge Pendergast interrupted, peering over his spectacles, also distinguishes between active appreciation of assets and passive existence. Mr. Sterling has made a compelling case that Nexus Stream is solely the result of Mr. Caldwell's genius, separate from the marital estate. It was a slaughter. Every motion Henry raised regarding the Cayman Islands receipt was shot down. We have a receipt for Triton Holdings, Henry argued desperately. We believe millions were funneled. Speculation, Sterling shouted. They have no bank records, no shareholder lists, nothing but a scrap of paper from 7 years ago. It's a fishing expedition, Your Honor. Sustained, Pendergast said, banging the gavel. Mr. Oldman, if you mention Triton Holdings again, without hard evidence, I will hold you in contempt. By 3 p.m., it was over. The testimony was finished. The evidence was closed. Judge Pendergast cleared his throat. He looked at the clock. I have heard enough. I see no reason to drag this out. The court is prepared to issue a ruling from the bench. Richard leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms. He turned his head toward Jennifer. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the judge to organize his notes. In that silence, Richard's voice carried across the gap between their tables. It was a whisper, but it hit Jennifer like a physical blow. I told you, Jen, Richard hissed, a cruel smile playing on his lips. You're nothing. I win. You walk out of here with what I give you, or you walk out with nothing. Look at you. Pathetic. He turned back to the judge, buttoning his suit jacket. I'm ready for my victory lap, he muttered to Sterling. Judge Pendergast opened his mouth to speak. In the matter of the assets of Nexus Stream, the court finds. Boom. The heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They slammed against the walls with a sound like a gunshot. The noise echoed through the high-ceilinged room. Every head turned. Judge Pendergast froze, his gavel hovering in midair. Richard spun around, annoyed at the interruption of his coronation. Standing in the doorway was a figure that seemed to suck the light out of the room. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, but he stood with the posture of a soldier. He wore a charcoal suit that was clearly old-fashioned, but impeccably tailored the kind of wool that isn't made anymore. He leaned heavily on a cane made of black polished wood, with a silver handle in the shape of a hawk's head. But it was his face that made the room go cold. It was a face carved from granite, lined with deep scars of experience. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and currently burning with a cold, terrifying fury. He didn't say a word. He just began to walk down the center aisle. Thump, step, thump, step. The sound of his cane hitting the floor was the only noise in the courtroom. Who is this? Richard whispered to Sterling. Get him out of here. Bailiff! Judge Pendergast shouted, recovering his composure. Remove this man. This is a closed session. The bailiff, a burly man named Officer Miller, stepped into the aisle, hand on his taser. "Sir, you can't be in here. You need to leave immediately." The old man stopped. He looked at the bailiff. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was so authoritative that Officer Miller actually took a step back. "Stand down, son," the man said. His voice was gravel and smoke. "Unless you want to explain to the State Bar why you obstructed an officer of the court." "Officer of the court?" Sterling stood up, laughing incredulously. "Who do you think you are? You're not on the docket." The old man ignored Sterling. He kept walking until he reached the gate and the wooden barrier that separates the public from the lawyers. He pushed it open with his cane. He walked past Richard. He didn't even look at him. He walked straight to the plaintiff's table. Jennifer was trembling. She stared at the man's profile, the familiar curve of his nose, the way he held his jaw. The last time she had seen him, he was leaving their house in a rusted pickup truck, promising he would fix things. That was 15 years ago. "Dad?" she choked out. The man turned to her. The hardness in his eyes melted for a fraction of a second. He reached out a gloved hand and gently touched her shoulder. "I'm sorry I'm late, sweetheart. Traffic on the I-5 was a nightmare." He then turned to the bench. Judge Pendergast was staring at the man with his mouth slightly open. His face had gone from flushed to a ghostly white. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and put them back on. "Thomas?" the judge whispered. "Thomas Blackwood?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. The older lawyers in the room, the ones who had been practicing in Seattle since the 82nds, suddenly sat up straighter. They started whispering to their younger associates. "Blackwood? Is that the hangman? It can't be. He disappeared after the Enron trials. I thought he was dead." Thomas Blackwood removed his gloves slowly, finger by finger. "Hello, Bill. It's been a while. You've put on weight. You have no standing here," Judge Pendergast stammered. He looked terrified. "You are not counsel of record." "Actually," Thomas said, reaching into his interior pocket and pulling out a folded document, "I filed an emergency motion to intervene with the clerk's office 10 minutes ago. And I am also entering my appearance as lead counsel for the plaintiff, Jennifer Caldwell." "You can't just waltz in here," Sterling shouted, sensing the shift in the room. "I object. This is highly irregular. The trial is concluded." Thomas Blackwood turned to Robert Sterling. He looked at the hotshot lawyer, the way a lion looks at a gazelle that doesn't know it's already dead. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas said calmly, "I was winning RICO cases when you were still learning how to tie your shoes. Sit down and shut up. I'm not done." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to reopen the evidentiary phase of this trial based on the discovery of new material evidence. Evidence of massive perjury, fraud, and embezzlement committed by the defendant, Richard Caldwell." "This is outrageous." Richard stood up, his face red. "I've disclosed everything. Who is this old fool?" Thomas Blackwood smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Who am I?" Thomas asked softly. "You don't recognize me, Richard? That's hurtful." Thomas turned to the gallery, picked up a heavy briefcase he had left by the gate, and slammed it onto the defense table, right in front of Richard. "You might not know my face," Thomas said, "but you know my work. You've been paying me for 5 years." Richard looked at the briefcase. Then he looked at Thomas. Confusion clouded his eyes. "What?" "7 years ago," Thomas said, his voice projecting to the back of the room, "you hired a boutique accounting firm in Zurich to set up a blind trust structure. You wanted to hide assets from your wife, in case you ever made it big. You communicated with a man named Mr. V. You paid him very well to hide your money in the Cayman Islands, in Singapore, and in a crypto vault in Malta." Richard's face went slack. The blood drained from his cheeks so fast, he looked like he might faint. You're Mr. V?" Richard whispered. "V for vendetta? No, that's too dramatic." Thomas chuckled darkly. "V for veritas. Truth. You see, Richard, when you reached out to the dark web, looking for a dirty accountant, you didn't find a criminal. You found me. I've been managing your hidden fortune for 5 years. I have every wire transfer. I have every email where you explicitly stated you were hiding this money from Jennifer. I have the logs of you laughing about how you were going to leave her penniless. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Thomas leaned in close to Richard, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper that the microphone still caught. I didn't steal your money, Richard. I kept it safe. I invested it. It's grown quite a bit. But here's the problem. You signed the power of attorney over to Mr. V. And since I am currently representing your wife, Thomas turned to the judge, his eyes blazing. Your Honor, I am submitting into evidence Exhibit A. It is the complete financial history of Triton Holdings, Omega Shell, and Blue Sky Ventures. The total value of assets Richard Caldwell hid from this court is not $400 million. Thomas paused for effect. It is $1.2 billion. And as of this morning, I have repatriated all those funds into a trust account under the jurisdiction of this court. Sterling slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew it was over. But Richard wasn't done. Panic overtook him. You can't do this. That's attorney-client privilege. You were my accountant. I was never a CPA, Thomas grinned. I'm a lawyer, and I was never your lawyer. I was an undercover operative for the Department of Justice for 20 years before I retired. I know a sting when I see one. But this wasn't business. This was personal. Thomas walked back to Jennifer, who was sobbing silently, hand over her mouth. He put a protective arm around her. You tried to destroy my daughter, Richard, Thomas said, his voice trembling with controlled rage. You announced your victory. You thought you were the king of the world, but you forgot one thing. What? Richard breathed, trembling. Kings fall, Thomas said, especially when the executioner comes home. The silence that descended upon the courtroom following Thomas Blackwood's revelation was not merely quiet. It was a physical weight, suffocating and absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum created when a massive, impenetrable ego is suddenly punctured. The air conditioner hummed a low, mechanical drone that seemed deafening in the stillness. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. The court reporter's hands hovered over her steno machine, her mouth slightly agape. The gallery, packed with reporters and curious onlookers who had come to witness Richard Caldwell's victory lap, was frozen in a collective state of shock. Richard Caldwell sat paralyzed. The color had drained from his face so completely that his skin looked like parchment. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, darted frantically between the battered briefcase on the table, the steely gaze of Thomas Blackwood, and the horrified expression of Judge Pendergast. He was a man drowning in plain sight, his brain scrambling to find a lifeline, a loophole, a lie that could plug the dam. But the water was rising too fast. This, Richard's voice cracked, a pathetic sound that bore no resemblance to the confident baritone he had used just an hour prior. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing a mask of outrage onto his features. This is a fabrication, a cheap parlor trick. He's lying, Your Honor. He's insane. Richard slammed his fist onto the mahogany table, but the gesture lacked power. It was the flailing of a child. Judge, arrest him. He hacked my accounts. He's presenting forged documents. Judge Pendergast did not order an arrest. In fact, the judge looked as though he might be sick. Beads of sweat had broken out across his forehead, glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. He gripped his gavel, not with authority, but for balance. He knew exactly who Thomas Blackwood was now. The older lawyers in the room had whispered the name, the hangman, with a reverence bordering on fear. Blackwood didn't bring cases to trial to argue them. He brought them to trial to end them. Pendergast looked at the mountain of financial logs, the Exhibit A, that Thomas had dumped onto the defense table. He realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach that his own career was hanging by a thread. If he appeared to be complicit in Richard's fraud, especially with a legend like Blackwood involved, he wouldn't just be disbarred, he would be indicted. Mr. Sterling, the judge croaked. He pulled a handkerchief from his robe and dabbed his upper lip, his hand trembling visibly. Do you have a response to this submission of evidence? Can you authenticate the source of these funds? All eyes turned to Robert Sterling, the shark of Seattle, the man who bragged about destroying families for sport, was staring at the documents in front of him. He picked up a sheet, a wire transfer log, from a shell company in Malta, and read it. His eyes widened. He recognized the account structure. He realized, with dawning horror, that his client had played him for a fool. Richard hadn't just hidden money from Jennifer, he had hidden it from Sterling, exposing the lawyer to federal conspiracy charges. Sterling slowly stood up. The movement was stiff, mechanical. He looked at Richard with a mixture of loathing and terror. "Robert?" Richard grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric. "What are you doing? Object. Move to strike. Do your job." Sterling looked down at Richard's hand as if it were a poisonous spider. He ripped his arm away with a violent jerk. "I am doing my job, Richard. I'm saving myself." Sterling turned to the bench, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, ensuring every reporter present heard his declaration. "Your Honor, I am formally withdrawing as counsel for the defendant, effective immediately." "You can't withdraw," Richard shrieked, his voice climbing an octave. "We are in the middle of a hearing. I pay you a retainer of $50,000 a month. I cannot and will not represent a client who has committed perjury in open court and utilized my firm's resources to facilitate international wire fraud," Sterling announced, his tone icy. He began shoving papers into his briefcase, not organizing them, just jamming them in. "I was completely unaware of the existence of Triton Holdings or any offshore assets. I am notifying the Washington State Bar Association immediately of this breach." "You coward," Richard screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "You work for me. I own you." "Not anymore," Sterling snapped. He clicked the latches of his briefcase. Shut snap. Snap a sound that echoed like 2 gunshots in the quiet room. "Good luck, Richard. You're going to need it." Sterling turned on his heel and marched out of the courtroom, pushing through the swinging gate without a backward glance. Richard was alone. The empty chair beside him felt like a chasm. Thomas Blackwood tapped his cane on the floor, thump, thump, drawing the room's attention back to the plaintiff's table. He looked calm, almost bored, as if he were watching a weather report rather than the destruction of a tycoon. "Your Honor," Thomas said, his voice smooth and gravelly, "since the defendant is now unrepresented, perhaps we should expedite this. I have the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York on hold in the clerk's office. They are listening to this proceeding remotely. They are quite interested in how Mr. Caldwell avoided capital gains tax on the $1.2 billion he funneled through the Cayman Islands." The mention of the Southern District of New York, the SDNY, was the final nail. This was no longer a civil divorce case. This was federal territory. Judge Pendergast's survival instinct kicked into overdrive. He needed to distance himself from Richard Caldwell, and he needed to do it now. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his voice hardening, stripping away the friendly bias he had shown earlier. "The court accepts the evidence presented by Mr. Blackwood. The documentation appears irrefutable." "Wait. No." Richard stood up, his composure shattering completely into jagged shards of panic. He pointed a shaking finger across the aisle at Jennifer. She sat quietly, her hands folded, looking small but immovable. "This is a setup," Richard yelled, his eyes wild. "She planned this. Look at her. She's trying to steal my company. I built Nexus. Me. She's just a nurse. She's a nobody. She is your wife," Thomas interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Richard's hysteria like a razor blade. "And she is the victim of your fraud. Under Washington state law, specifically regarding the concealment of assets during dissolution proceedings, the court has the discretion to penalize the fraudulent party by awarding 100% of the hidden assets to the victimized spouse." Thomas turned his gaze to the judge, his eyes blazing with a cold, hard fire. "I am moving for a summary judgment, Your Honor. We are not asking for half anymore. We want everything: the hidden billions, the marital home, the entire stock portfolio, and the controlling interest in Nexus Stream. We want it all." Judge Pendergast didn't hesitate. He barely looked at the papers. Granted, the word hung in the air. The court fines for the plaintiff. Pendergast ruled quickly, banging his gavel with a force that startled the bailiff. All assets listed in Exhibit A are hereby awarded to Jennifer Caldwell. Furthermore, I am issuing an immediate freezing order on all of Mr. Caldwell's personal accounts, domestic and foreign, pending the federal investigation. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing the divorce. He was losing his identity. The money, the power, the status, it was all gone in the span of 10 minutes. A primal, guttural roar ripped from his throat. Logic abandoned him. "I'll kill you. You ruined me. You be." Richard lunged. He scrambled over the defense table, papers flying everywhere, charging toward Jennifer with his hands outstretched, fingers curled into claws. "Richard, no," Jennifer gasped, shrinking back. But he never reached her. Officer Miller, the burly bailiff who had earlier tried to eject Thomas, moved with linebacker speed. He intercepted Richard in the middle of the aisle, slamming into him with a sickening thud. They went down hard. Richard's expensive Italian suit scraped against the rough carpet. "Get off me. Do you know who I am? I am the CEO of Nexus Stream. You're under arrest for assault and contempt of court," Miller shouted, wrestling Richard's arms behind his back. The metallic clink-clink of handcuffs engaging was audible even over Richard's screaming. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Flashbulbs popped blindingly as the press rushed the wooden railing, desperate to get the shot of the year. The king of Seattle tech, face pressed into the floor, drooling and raving, as Richard was hauled to his feet, disheveled, his tie crooked, his hair wild. He frantically scanned the back of the room. "Brittany," he screamed, his eyes searching for his young mistress. "Call the fixers. Get the governor on the phone. Brittany!" But the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom were swaying gently. Brittany was gone. She had slipped out the moment Thomas Blackwood had opened the briefcase, vanishing like smoke. There would be no fixers. There would be no governor. Officer Miller and 2 deputies dragged Richard toward the side exit. He kicked and thrashed, shouting obscenities that echoed off the high ceiling until the heavy door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. Silence returned to the courtroom, but it was different now. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannon fire has ceased. Jennifer sat stunned, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sudden violence, the speed of the ruling, the image of Richard in handcuffs, it was too much to process. She felt lightheaded. She looked up at the old man standing beside her. Thomas Blackwood was leaning on his cane, watching the door where Richard had disappeared. His expression was unreadable, perhaps a mix of satisfaction and weariness. He turned to her, and the hardness in his face melted away. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "Is it over?" Jennifer whispered, her voice trembling. Thomas Blackwood smiled, a genuine, warm expression that creased the corners of his tired eyes. "Yes, Jenny," he said softly. "It's over. You won." The storm that had battered Seattle all morning finally broke as they stepped out of the courthouse. The heavy, slate-gray clouds fractured, allowing piercing shafts of afternoon sunlight to hit the wet pavement, turning the oil-slicked streets into rivers of gold. It was the kind of abrupt weather shift the Pacific Northwest was famous for, a sudden calm after the violence. Jennifer felt a strange disconnect from her own body. An hour ago, she had been a destitute nurse, facing total ruin. Now, she was arguably one of the wealthiest women in the state. But the money didn't feel real yet. What felt real was the man walking beside her. He moved slower now. Inside the courtroom, Thomas Blackwood had been a titan, a force of nature that sucked the oxygen out of the room. But out here, in the cold air, the adrenaline was fading. He leaned heavily on his hawk-headed cane, his breath catching slightly with the effort of the walk. He looked less like the hangman and more like a father who had been away too long. They ended up at Rusty's Diner, a narrow, chrome-lined establishment 3 blocks from the legal district. It was a relic of old Seattle, smelling of burnt coffee, bacon grease, and lemon floor cleaner. It was the polar opposite of the glass and steel cages Richard preferred. They slid into a red vinyl booth near the back. A waitress with tired eyes poured them 2 mugs of black coffee without asking. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Jennifer wrapped her hands around the ceramic mug, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. She stared at the man across from her. He was studying the menu as if it were a complex legal brief, avoiding her gaze. "Why?" Jennifer asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the quiet diner, it sounded like a shout. Just, "Why?" Thomas set the menu down. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture she remembered from her childhood. It made her chest ache. "Why did I come back? Or why did I leave?" he asked, his voice rough. "Both," she said. 15 years, Dad. Mom died waiting for you. She thought you abandoned us for another woman. She died thinking you didn't love us." The pain that flashed across Thomas's face was raw and unguarded. He looked out the window at the passing traffic, his jaw tightening. "I loved you more than anything in this world, Jenny. That's exactly why I had to leave." He took a sip of the bitter coffee, steeling himself. "You know, I was a lawyer, but you didn't know the clients. In the late 90s, I wasn't just handling corporate mergers. I was the fixer for the kind of people who don't get sued, they get indicted. Cartels, corrupt senators, the syndicates." Jennifer stared at him, her coffee forgotten. "I was good at it," Thomas continued, his voice dropping low. "Too good. I knew where all the bodies were buried, literally and financially. But in 2008, I grew a conscience. I couldn't do it anymore. I went to the DOJ. I turned state's witness against the Sinaloa faction and a ring of money launderers in D.C. "I never saw that on the news," Jennifer said. "No, because if it had hit the news, you would be dead," Thomas said flatly. "I refused witness protection because they wanted to uproot you and your mother. I couldn't put you through that life, looking over your shoulder, changing names, living in fear. So, I made a deal. I disappeared. I staged my exit so it looked like a midlife crisis. I broke your mother's heart to save her life. If the cartel thought I was just a runaway dad, they wouldn't touch you. If they knew I was an informant," he trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "So you became a ghost," Jennifer whispered. "I became Mr. V," Thomas corrected, with a dry, humorless smile. "I utilized the skills I learned from the criminals to hide from them. I lived in Europe, then Asia. I managed money on the dark web. That's how I found Richard. When a man looks for a dirty accountant to hide $1 billion, he eventually crosses my path." He reached across the scarred table. His hand, covered in liver spots and old scars, trembled slightly as it covered hers. "I watched you, though. Every day." Jennifer's breath hitched. "How?" "I have eyes everywhere, Jen. I saw you graduate nursing school. You wore a blue dress under your gown. I saw you meet Richard at that coffee shop in Tacoma. I saw you marry him." Thomas's eyes glossed over with tears. "I wanted to walk you down that aisle so bad, it felt like I was dying. I stood in the back of the church, in the shadows. I left before the reception. You were there?" Jennifer let out a sob. "I was always there, but I couldn't step in. Not until now. The men who hunted me are dead or rotting in supermax prisons. But when I saw Richard hire Robert Sterling, I knew the system was going to crush you. I couldn't watch another bully destroy my little girl." Thomas reached into his interior jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded napkin and a heavy, leather-bound checkbook. He slid them across the table. "The assets from the Cayman accounts, the crypto vaults in Malta, the shell companies in Singapore, it's all been repatriated," Thomas said, his tone shifting back to business. "The wire transfers cleared 10 minutes ago. You are now the majority shareholder of Nexus Stream. The board of directors is currently in a panic. They're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning to elect you chairwoman." Jennifer looked at the napkin. On it, in her father's frantic scrawl, was a list of account numbers and a final sum that made her head spin. 1.2 billion. She laughed, a wet, incredulous sound that bubbled up from her chest. "Dad, I'm a nurse. I change IVs. I don't run tech conglomerates. I don't know the first thing about cloud computing." You don't need to know code to run a company, Jen, Thomas said firmly. Richard knew code, and look where it got him. To run a company, you need a moral compass. You need to know right from wrong. You can hire the best CEO in the world to do the heavy lifting. You set the vision. You determine the soul of the place. Jennifer wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at the checkbook, then back at the old man. What about you? She asked. The trial is over. Are you going to disappear again? Are you going back to the dark web? Thomas hesitated. He looked down at his cane, running his thumb over the silver hawk's head. He looked older than he ever had. The fire that had fueled him in the courtroom was replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I'm old, Jen. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being a ghost. He looked up at her, hope fragile in his eyes. I have 15 years of lost time to make up for. If you'll have me. Jennifer didn't hesitate. She squeezed his hand, holding on to him as if he might vanish if she let go. I have a guest room in my new apartment, she said. It's small. It faces an alley, not the ocean. But it's warm. Thomas smiled, and this time, it reached his eyes. It sounds like a palace. 6 months later, the fall of Richard Caldwell was absolute. The federal indictment, fueled by the evidence Thomas Blackwood provided, was watertight. There were no plea deals, no high-priced settlements. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, tax evasion, and perjury. His isolation was total. Brittany, his young mistress, didn't stick around for the sentencing. Instead, she sold her story to Vanity Fair for 6 figures, detailing Richard's erratic behavior and abusive outbursts, effectively destroying any chance he had of returning to society. Jennifer Caldwell did not move back into the lakefront estate. She found it cold and filled with bad memories. She sold the mansion, the Tuscan villa, the sports cars, and the art collection. With the proceeds, she founded the Caldwell Blackwood Foundation. It wasn't just a tax write-off, it was a war room. The foundation provided top-tier legal defense for women trapped in financially abusive marriages, hiring the best forensic accountants to ensure no other woman would ever be told she was worthless just because her name wasn't on the bank account. As for Nexus Stream, Jennifer remained the owner, but she knew her limits. She hired a new CEO, Sarah Jenkins, a brilliant administrator she had worked with at the hospital, someone who understood people better than algorithms. Under Jennifer's guidance as chairwoman, the company culture shifted from cutthroat arrogance to sustainable innovation. But the real victory wasn't in the boardroom. On Sunday mornings, if you walk down to the misty pier in West Seattle, past the tourists and the fish markets, you might see them. A woman with a kind face and a lighter step, standing beside an older man in a wool coat, leaning on a black cane. They usually have fishing lines in the water, though they rarely catch anything. They don't talk about billions of dollars, hostile takeovers, or the past that haunted them. They talk about the weather. They talk about what to cook for dinner. They talk about the future. They talk like a family. For 15 years, Jennifer thought she was alone in the dark. But as she stood on the pier, listening to her father laugh at a terrible joke, she realized the truth. She wasn't standing in anyone's shadow anymore. She was finally, truly, standing in the light. Richard Caldwell spent his life building a fortune, thinking money made him invincible. He thought he could discard people like trash. But in the end, he learned the hardest lesson of all. You can buy a lawyer, you can buy a judge, and you can even buy a new life. But you can never buy the loyalty of a father protecting his daughter. Jennifer walked away with more than just the money. She got her family back. Richard walked away with handcuffs. If this story made you cheer for the underdog, hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want more stories about justice being served ice cold, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a video. What would you have done if you were Jennifer? Would you have forgiven Richard or taken him for everything he had? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.